Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
Rabbi Shapiro and I realized that last book with Breshit, we said that we were going to choose, at the end of every book, we were going to choose the last few verses. And Rabbi Shapiro got to the last few verses and realized, well, there's nothing really on these verses, so we have failed you, friends. We have failed you. So we did it for one book, and that was great, and we're not going to do it for this book. We're going to choose other verses for this book that I will let Rabbi Shapiro introduce. But interestingly enough, one little trivia piece that I will add to this that I think I mentioned elsewhere, so depending on how many of my things you attend, you might have heard me say this already. We're reading two Parshiot, but the general story in this week's Parsha, combined Parsha, is exactly the same as 2 and 3 Parshiot ago. Some of the language is quite literally copy and pasted from Parshat Truma, and some of it is just the general idea or makeup of the Mishkan coming back to us again now in these Parshiot. So it's interesting that we had like a little blip of narrative in between, but then when we come back into building the Mishkan, it's basically exactly the same as when we saw it before, and then it's going to move forward from here. So if you're hearing things, or when Rabbi Shapiro is going through the verses, you're seeing verses that you think look similar to other weeks that we just had. You are not alone. I also was confused and worried that I was reading the wrong Parsha, but in fact, they're just exactly the same, and we're getting back to Elon's question a few weeks ago, why doesn't it just say, and they made this nice? We get the instructions yet again for this very intricate Mishkan. So with that, I will turn over to Rabbi Shapiro.
I will say that if you want different psukim tomorrow morning, the Bar Mitzvah boy, Lucas Shane, has a fantastic drash on some of the closing verses to the book. So I will say, if you want to hear them. He wrote a great drash, and the rabbi who helped him with it did a fabulous job. Okay, here we go. All right. Oh, Svaria, behave yourself, please. Okay, we're going to pick up about a chapter or so into the first of the two Parshiot that are one Parsha that we're doing this week. So we're not going to give you too many of the, I'm sure, very exciting to you details of each and every intricate part of the tabernacle itself, although scattering blood around is fun, as other rabbis, Shapiro and Schatz, have taught us from about 2 weeks ago. We're not going to be talking about that either. We're going to actually pick up on a little nugget of narrative that contains. Rabbi Schatz, were you aware of like the embedded halakha in one of our verses? Were you aware of that?
I don't know exactly what you're referring to.
Great. So that I'm going to take that as a no. An embedded bit of narrative with interesting halakhic ramifications somewhere along the way. But I just mostly want to talk to you guys about Chassidut. It's Rabbi Schatz's job to talk to you about halakha, but maybe I will deign.
I want you to get to the first verse because I have a funny story to tell about it. So can you start?
I can. And I will. Okay, so Betzalel and Oholiav are in charge, along with all the other skilled people, of making this thing, of making this tabernacle. Moshe calls them. He says, there are interesting phrases. There's these ideas of chacham lev, right, which gets translated as endowed with. Okay. Was that it, Rabbi Schatz? It's
no.
Pee-wee's Playhouse. It's like the word of the day.
I want to share just a very brief, very funny story.
You literally made me talk for 3 seconds so you could interrupt me. Okay.
I do realize that I just did that. Anyway, it says chacham lev, but then it says Asher natan Adonai chochma utvuna Bahema, I couldn't read it. Lada'at. Okay, so Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at come up here. You might know that Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at are the three words whose first letters make up the very famous Jewish community of Chabad. I did not know that. Approximately 2.5 years ago, had no idea, just thought Chabad was a thing, didn't know that it came from that, knew these three words, didn't know they came together to be Chabad. I wrote my cover letter to apply to Temple Beth Am to be the assistant rabbi. And
I thought you were going to say for a second that you wrote your cover letter to apply to work for Chabad, which would be fantastic and on some level would check out as well.
No. And I, as part of my cover letter, I wrote that I hope to bring Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at to Temple Beth Am. And I explained what those three things are, meaning wisdom, knowledge, and spiritual understanding. I sent in my cover letter. Obviously, people liked it. Here I am. And Rabbi Klickfeld read my cover letter and emailed me and said, I'm really not supposed to be commenting on anything you're sending in during this process. I just want to let you know that I look forward to, if you are the assistant rabbi at Temple Beth Am, seeing how you bring Chabad to our community. And then he had to explain to me how he got there based on my cover letter. And so if any of you want me to be bringing a little bit of more Chabad to Temple Beth Am, it came from this verse. And I will now let Rabbi Shapiro continue.
I am delighted by that story on a number of levels. It was worth the interruption, 5 seconds of what I was doing. That's fantastic. Do you know where they get those three from, Rabbi Schatz? Do you know why?
Who gets them?
Why they use those three words?
Yeah.
It's because it's the upper three sefirot.
Ah, very good. Bringing us back to the Chassidut. Very good.
But that's why. I mean, it's the verse, but it's also because those become the upper three sefirot.
Yeah. I was a mystic even when I applied.
That's what I always say about you. You are a closet mystic and a closet Chabadnik. Okay. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we're making a Mishkan. Okay. Moshe calls these artisans, who are Chacham Lev, to come, and you can see that phrase repeated, right? There was a version of this class where we were going to drill down on that. We're not, but it's a fascinating phrase, being wise of heart. And that's what qualifies you to work on the Mishkan. Moshe calls these artisans to come and work and execute the task, right? Like when we think about, as Rabbi Schatz was saying, how these chunks of Parshiot mirror each other. One way of thinking about it is that one lays out the blueprint and one is the implementation, right? And so he's saying, all right, it's time to get this done. They take the gifts that the Israelites had brought to make this happen. This word of malacha pops up in some interesting ways, as we will see. That's the teaser for the halachic piece that I was talking about. Yes, Rabbi Schatz?
No, I said now I know what you're talking about. I didn't know what you were referring to before, but now I know what
so at least I'm consistent. Okay, so to do this malacha, to do this holy work, and here's what we're getting into. And they keep bringing these offerings, right? They keep bringing these offerings forward, baboker, right? Like morning after morning, which is a fascinating phrase. And all of these wise people, right? They're I guess the verse doesn't make sense in isolation, right? They continue to bring forward these offerings morning after offering. All of these artisans, everyone's coming forward, like this real sense of overflow in terms of what's being brought and how much of it is being brought. And so here's where we're going to land on our verses for the day. We're going to do chapter 36, verses 5, 6, and 7. Vayomru el Moshe lemor, they said to Moses, saying, these artisans, they say, Merabim ha'am lahavi. The people are bringing too much. Midei havoda limlacha asher tziva Adonai la'asot ota. They're bringing too much in terms of what's actually needed for what God has commanded to be done. Vayitzav Moshe And Moses, therefore, proclaimed, but really commanded, Vayaviru kol b'machane lemor, and he shared his voice throughout the camp, saying, Ish ve'isha al ya'asu od malacha litrumat hakodesh. Each man and woman shouldn't do any more work in terms of bringing forth these gifts into the sanctuary. Vayikaleh ha'am mehavi, and the people stopped bringing forward what they were bringing forward. I will note as well, like, unusual in the Torah, specifying ish and isha, right? That's not ordinarily a construct that you would see. So making note, first of all, that it's really every person, but also therefore you can presumably read back that men and women are involved in the bringing forth of these gifts, which is interesting to note. And then verse 7, V'hamlacha haita dayam lechol hamlacha lasot ota vehoter, right? So this is it. The verse is interestingly constructed here. The work that they were doing was enough for all the work, right? V'hamlacha haita dayam lechol hamlacha lasot ota. The work was enough for all the work that they were doing on it, and it was too much, right? Rabbi Schatz, do you have a better way of translating this? Like the efforts had been more than enough for all the tasks that had to be done. So the more than enough, but it's like it was enough, and it was also too much. I'm intentionally translating it a little weird because that's sort of teasing the Chassidut piece that I'm excited to bring, but it's an oddly constructed sentence.
And I will just point out, in terms of the structure of the sentence, the way that the trope was then put into the sentence does not make it any easier to understand. We often look at trope as a way of seeing like a comma or even like a semicolon. There are no stops in the way in which this verse is read with trope.
Well, there is the et nachta is here, but it's at the very end. Right? So you say, V'hamlacha haita dayam lechol hamlacha lasot ota vehotar, right? Like that. Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm very good at chanting with Nikut. Thank you very much. All sorts of skills. But point being that the word saying it's extra feels extra, right? Like why is that word? You said there was, right? They had enough stuff, but also there was extra stuff. What's going on here? All right, I'm gonna pause there. Rabbi Schatz, over to you. Let's get some Kushiyot going.
Great. Can you just make 6, 7, and 8 bigger, please? Thank you. Oh.
You mean 5, 6, 7?
Yes, that is what I mean.
Well, it's...
well, no. Okay, it's fine. It's fine.
There we go. I did it.
Wow, good job. Okay, Renee, you have your hand up. Questions, not comments from anybody. I mean, you can make comments, I guess, but questions more. Kushiyot or questions?
I just wanted to know, what is more than is needed? Like, what was there? Was there a specific thing requirements that they needed to have so much of this and so much of that?
Great.
And they had beyond that, or what?
Rabbis asked that question also. What does it mean more than? Like, what are we talking about?
And especially like among the Jews, more than? I mean, there's never enough among us Jews. You never bring enough.
Yeah, so I think there's question as to, was it more than for the person individually, or was it more than for the tabernacle, or was it more than for the artisans who are working on the tabernacle? Right? It's a great question just all on its own. What is more than? What does it mean that there was more than enough? Jay.
I asked this question a lot. I know we've heard this one many times, but how did the Israelites get all this equipment and stuff in order to make the Mishkan? Yeah,
great. I was in a midrash class yesterday. A friend of mine teaches, and someone asked the same question, and he referred us back to the Prince of Egypt. That I guess in the Prince of Egypt, which, as we all know, is Torah Sinai, you saw when they left Egypt, they had I don't remember this, I'm just quoting him. There are big pieces of wood on their shoulders carrying them through the Exodus. So though I don't know if that is actual fact or accurate, yes, there can be miracles when you believe, that that Rabbi Shapiro has been singing in every meeting I've been with him recently, so maybe he'll sing for us a little bit later. But
I already sang. I chanted Torah.
I do think that many of the items that they end up having throughout this experience were either taken from the Egyptians in that looting moment that they had early on, or through just the accumulation of stuff that they had as they were going through. So that's my guess. But
to compound Jay's question, I'm not going to answer this later. I'll just compound the question. Okay. Rabbi Schatz might have an answer. She usually does. They just built this golden calf with all their stuff, right? How do they not only have enough, but more than enough to make this new thing when they were just tossing all their gold in this fire to make this naughty golden calf that they made?
Any other questions? Yeah, Ilan.
So I can't think of it. It seems to me that at least up until this point, I can't think of an example where God says, no, really, that's enough. So why now is all of a sudden, because with all due respect to God, it seems like, come on, guys, keep bringing it on. We love it. Animals, gold, silver, it's all beautiful. And all of a sudden he becomes, like, yeah, that's enough. Thanks anyway,
Yeah. Great question that I definitely don't have an answer to, and interesting that that though I read it the same way you are reading it, it's not necessarily clear that God is the one who's saying that there's enough, right? It could be that Bezalel has too much, or Moses is saying there's too much, but it is interesting that the people stop bringing, and that seems to be satisfactory to God. Therefore, we might read it as God thinking there's an abundant amount of material. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts? Okay. Rabbi Shapiro, why don't you... Oh, Rabbi Shapiro says, I have some pieces on that. So why don't you start?
I was thinking folks were going to keep talking for a little while. I wasn't going to say that as a way right to jump in, but I can. Rabbi Schatz, are you going to get into the Malacha piece in verse 6? Do you have anything on that? Because it was interesting, but it wasn't going to be my focus.
Yeah, I did not focus on it either.
Okay. Cool. I'll offer one short piece, and then I'll get into the longer chunk that I found. The one short piece was I was flipping through. You guys know I love Aviva Zornberg's stuff. She drew an interesting connection, Ilan, to your question about why now? Why now is that boundary being drawn in terms of saying, no, don't give too much? She does draw kind of like a narrative connection between what happened with the golden calf and what's happening now, that it seems like there is this this impulse within the people, right? Just like the golden calf, to like give and give and give towards something physical, and concerned that even though this has tilted away from the idolatrous impulse into more of the sort of focused in impulse that this is the way that's being specified to serve God, that an unrestrained impulse is also not a good thing, right? That there's something about it being a authentic and genuine, but still boundaried way of contributing, right? That it should be meaningful, right? That it should be substantial, that it should be a free will offering, but that there should still be like some kind of boundary in terms of what's happening, so that it's not this total basically overshare in a different way, right? But that it shouldn't be like too much of, right? There is too much of a good thing. That it shouldn't be too much, which I thought was just an interesting narrative connection in terms of the golden calf piece. There's a longer piece. I can take a breath there while I pull up the longer piece if folks have other questions or anybody wants to respond to that. Oops, and I just lost the piece I was going to share. Okay. I can share the longer piece. This is a chunk. It's off of a source sheet put together Rabbi Getzel Davis, who I met in passing once. I believe, I'm not quite sure where he is now. He was the rabbi at Harvard Hillel for a little while, I believe. So a contemporary of ours. So thank you for pulling this source sheet together. And he plonks a nice piece of Kedushat Levi, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. Rabbi Schatz, is this the piece that you shared with Rabbi Klickfeld, or did you share a different piece? Okay, so you let me know. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, one of the...
I think so, yes.
Okay, great. Translated by Rabbi Art Green. So picking up on this third verse of ours, and this idea that we're already pulling apart a little bit. How can it be that it was sufficient, and also that it was too much, right? If we're saying that they had enough and also too much, what's going on there? So he articulates that, right? These two words seem to contradict each other. If it was sufficient, why are you saying there's also more? What's this hutar? So here we go back to Rabbi Schatz and her Chabad-ing. So Reb Levi Yitzchak pulls a quick quote from the Gemara. Bezalel, the lead on this project, he knew all the stuff, right? He knew the different permutations of letters through which heaven and earth were created, right? That this idea that the world is created through letters, that's a common idea in rabbinic theology. So he knew a lot. God placed chokhmah, bina, and da'at into their hearts, wisdom, awareness, and understanding, however you want to translate those. God grants this power to the righteous of each generation. As righteous people engage in Torah and offer new interpretations, this is a beautiful idea, they're creating a new heaven and a new earth. Like, that's, first of all, let's just pause there for a second. That's a really cool idea, right? That in each and every generation, as the righteous, and even some of us who are not so righteous, engage in Torah and come up with new interpretations of the Torah, we're actually creating worlds, which is just a really, really beautiful idea. And there is a parallel when we think about this between the creation of the Mishkan, right? That there's like a tabernacle here on earth and also like a corresponding tabernacle up, as it were, in heaven. So in constructing the tabernacle, the builders directed their Holy Spirit to be in the precise accord with divine wisdom, performing acts of union, permutation of letters with each vessel they formed and each deed they undertook. So as we know, like a real expansion of this idea that has surfaced sometimes in pushing it to another level, right? We talk in this class often, so much so that it was parodied on Purim, right? That each and every verse, word, letter is in there for a reason. So much so that like the architects of the tabernacle, they're making this stuff. There's such care with they're pulling from the letters. The letters are what create, and they're pulling out each vessel, each thing they do. It's undergirded with this divine wisdom. And they were such tzaddikim. They were so wise that if they wanted, they could have kept going forever. There wasn't necessarily going to be an end to this project. If they wanted to keep working, this idea of expansive mind, which is an idea that you'll see in Jewish mysticism, mochin de gadlut, right? There's like the everyday mind, mochin de katnut, and the expansive mind, the divine mind of mochin de gadlut, like literally little brain and big brain, which doesn't quite sound as good as expansive mind, but there you go. They could have gone on endlessly, for the Spirit of God was upon. Right? They could have just kept going and going and going. But they had to put limits on their work. They had to put limits on it. Thus, they left room for the righteous still to come along in the future to teach about the construction. There's some typos in here. To teach about the construction of the tabernacle, each of them using their minds to uncover secrets of wisdom in every word and in each vessel. And thus they would bring about ever new acts of sublime union. So I'm gonna pause there for a chunk of time. There's only a couple more sentences. No, wait, there's more. All right, I'm gonna pause there for a second. This idea that they could have kept going, but they put limits on what they're doing to make room for others. So this idea that there's enough and there's more. that this dance between they could have kept going, but they chose not to, and that's actually an act of generosity and offers room for more people to be able to create instead of just basically monopolizing it for themselves. And here's a parallel with God, right? In creating the world, God left over some of that creative energy, putting a limit on creation in order to leave room for the righteous yet to come to be creative as well. So this is turning into Rabbi Shapiro rants about Jewish mysticism for longer than you really want him to. But there's another embedded idea here, this idea of tzimtzum, which I'm sure many of you know, this idea that in order for the world to be created, God had to withdraw. God had to restrict God's presence in order to leave enough room for the world to be created. It's not stated explicitly here, but it's only about 10% away, right? God left room for there to be more creating to happen. And so too, the builders of the tabernacle did the same thing. So that's why the Torah says both enough and also more. Sufficient enough means that they placed limits on their work because all that they were to do, they were setting it up so that it would bring about unification. They carried this as far as their own minds would permit. More means that they left room for the righteous and wise in every generation who would hear and learn about the building of the tabernacle, just like we're talking about this morning, for all of you righteous people who are listening, to continue the building and add of their own mind as far as their own understanding can reach. I want to say my best stab at a 2-sentence summary of that, and then I'll pause. The reason it says enough and more is because it was a choice made by the people who were building the tabernacle to create enough of it so that there would in turn be the possibility for additional creation and learning to happen. I'll tilt towards away from the purely kind of academic, esoteric understanding of this into something a little more real world-y, which is that when we think about relationships, when we think about how we live our lives in relationship to spouses, kids, spirituality, right? Whatever it is, there has to be enough left that we're not taking up all the space ourselves, and that it's actually healthy to find the dance between what is enough and what's too much, and how by doing more, it actually leads to less, and by withholding some of ourselves, it creates the opportunity for more to emerge. Karen will be nodding, even though I can't see her, right? This idea that a healthy relationship is neither complete independence nor codependency, but interdependence. And I think that idea is popping up here. I'm going to stop talking for a little while, but I really like this text, and I thought it was quite groovy. Elon, please tell me you're going to do your best Rabbi Matt Shapiro impersonation right now.
Sorry. So I agree that this is I like this piece, but I find there to be a conflict between the emphasis that this piece puts on creativity and the specificity of the instructions vis-a-vis the tabernacle, right? So if in fact God had intended the artists and other people involved with the building of the Mishkan to be creative, why the specificity? Doesn't that in fact impede creativity as opposed to promote it?
Great. So to make sure I understand your question, the question on that being, this piece is indicating how much creativity can really expand out through this divine inspiration, but how can you say it's creativity if it's happening within this very, very strict framework in terms of the instructions that are given at substantial length over these prakim about the building of the tabernacle? Is that the question? Yes. I have a thought on it, but I'm happy to pull back. See what I did there? For a minute or two. And Joanne, I see you have your hand up. And Renee.
Yeah, so I also have somewhat of a thought and a response. I don't know if it goes far enough, but we had an episode where the people had like total freedom and creativity to do something, and they did it in a very wrong way, namely the golden calf. So, and I think maybe one of the lessons coming out of the golden calf is that a leadership that is talking about interdependency, a leadership that is totally dependent on, Moses doing all the stuff, or Moses and Aaron doing all the stuff, and the people not having a role wasn't going to work. So there needed to be a way to have the people have a role, and also a way to somehow circumscribe that there's a framework within which creativity is welcome in a way that is in line with the values of our people.
Yeah, but my problem is I don't see that. I see that in this interpretation. I don't see that in the actual words of the Torah itself.
Joanna, do you want to respond to that?
I don't know that I have all that much more to say. I mean, I think Elon has a point there, and this is us, trying to fill in the space later, just like as this commentary is saying, to make room for, we have this text, and now the later generations, adding to it.
Yeah, Renee, you can go ahead. I have lots of thoughts, and I'm generating more, but I want to. Rabbi Schatz knows, like, I'm off and running. Rabbi Schatz is ready to sign off and say see you next week, but
I'm enjoying the conversation. I don't
all right. Okay.
Great story at the beginning. That can be my contribution.
It was a really good story. I'm not beating that story, no matter how wonky I get on this. Yes, Renee.
I'm just questioning, all fine and good with wanting to have the righteous participate in that stuff, but what about giving the people who an opportunity to learn from their mistakes as well? Because I kind of felt like when I was reading that it's only like this elite little group that's allowed to partake in that, and other people are not. Yeah, maybe I'm off the wall. I don't know.
No. It's a great question. I mean, it's coming at it from a completely different angle, but it's a really important question when it comes to, as has been stated ad nauseum in our sessions together. I really enjoy exploring Hasidic texts, and there are certain really challenging pieces reading them in 21st century Los Angeles, right? Issues of gender, like issues of xenophobia, like there are some really problematic components. And one of those, is that depending on which teacher you're reading, and even though I talk about it a lot, I am still at best an intermediate novice when it comes to this stuff. So I can't list out for you who falls where in terms of which schools, but some Hasidic teachers more so than others have a very elitist bent to them, right? And will say that there's a way of accessing many of these teachings for pretty much everyone, but in terms of who really holds authority, that there is an elite that holds sway in terms of who has access and authority to sort of teach and preach when it comes to this stuff. I think it's possible to expand that out, right? And I certainly have, and I'm not the only one, right? Rabbi Art Green has written extensively on this. He has a great article called A Neo-Hasidic Credo, if you want to check it out. I know Rabbi Schatz reads it nightly. But if you check that out, he talks about finding ways to sort of authentically but intentionally pull those teachings forward into our current moment, and wrestling with that idea of the more elitist versus the more democratic impulses within Hasidic thought is definitely something that he explores, plays with, and works to expand. I was going to move to Elon's point, but I see Joanna's going to rebut him successfully for me.
I actually see this as one of the most democratic pieces that we have in Torah, because first of all, the fact that women are specifically mentioned. And I also read this passage as there were some people who were contributing their skills, but there were other people who were contributing stuff. And because the verse, which verse is it? Verse verse 5, right, just refers to the Am, not to skilled artisans, not to talented people, but just Am, which to me reads as all of the people. So I read this, I don't know if it's a correct reading, that everyone, lots of people were contributing stuff. Those who had stuff to contributed stuff. And those who were skilled in various aspects contributed their skills. So there was lots of room for different types of contributions.
For sure. In the pshat of the text, absolutely. And in some of the interpretations of that verse, so too. I mean, it seems like Rabbi Schatz isn't necessarily going to pick this up too much, so there's more to be said about it. But it seems like when it comes to thinking about Shabbat observance, verse 6 is a really big deal. Like this idea of malacha and pausing, and the ideas of tabernacle and Shabbat are very much interwoven in rabbinic literature because of how it's situated. And when it comes to like why everyone pauses on Shabbat, that verse is given as the proof text, right? Men and women. Oh, what do you know? Women should get a break too. What a crazy idea in rabbinic Judaism. But that's the verse that's given. So absolutely that it seems to be as democratic as verses get in the text of the Torah itself. I was responding to Renee's question in terms of within the Hasidic text itself, when it says like the tzaddikim, right, it specifies righteous, righteous, righteous. Well, what about the not so righteous, right? What about those of us, and it's most of us, who are Beinoniim, right? Who are sort of like not saints, not total sinners, just kind of somewhere in the middle. And where's the room for each of us to contribute in that way? Which I think is a fair question on that text and a fair question on many Hasidic texts, and the challenge of wrestling with that. Rabbi Schatz, I'm talking a lot. I'm going to respond to Ilan's question, and then I'm happy to take an extended nap.
I mean, I'm people are enjoying this conversation. I don't need to add anything. Go ahead.
Great. I'm having a great time, and hopefully other people are too. Ilan, to your point, I think it's a very Ilan question. Next year, I'm going to dress up as I'm going to play more of the Ilan role next one. And it's an important question, right? This idea of why are we being told so specifically what to do? If we're talking about being creative, why isn't there more leeway, right? Why does it need to be creative within such a specific framework? Why is it so dictatorial in terms of what has to happen? I think it's a fair question. Bonnie, are you going to answer? Are you going to answer that question? Because your hand went up when I asked it that way. Oh, but you're muted, so you're giving the best answer ever to that question, and we're not hearing it. Oh, no.
Yeah, okay, here I am.
Here you are. Hello.
So I do a lot of needlework on various things, and so it doesn't tell you how. It says the colors. The people who are working with textures have leeway as to how they're going to do it, and I think the same with whether it's the copper or how they're setting the stones in various places. So I think there is some place for their own interpretations of how to do it, and some creativity allowed, even though the basic structure was really given to them.
Yeah, and I think both specifically, and I think writ large, right, I can only speak for myself. I think it's most helpful for me to be creative within a specific framework, right? Like you'll hear writers talk about the challenge of the blank page, right? Like if you just open up a blank page and it's like, write the great American novel, it's like, well, I don't know how to do that. I have no idea how to write the great American novel to begin with. But I think the total unboundaried sense of like, just go create something, I think is really challenging and overwhelming. I think being told, here are the parameters in which you're working, and now you create something. For me, that's much more helpful. Ilan, I think you're also partly asking the question. It's talking about creativity, but it doesn't really seem like it's creativity. I do think that's creativity, right? I think it is creative within a framework, but just because there's a framework, it doesn't mean it's not creative. I think that is how Rabbinic Judaism works, right? That's the project of Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbi Schatz and I aren't coming on here and be like, today we wanted to talk about whatever topic the two of us were kibitzing about earlier, right? It's grounded in the Parsha, and we work within that. And a lot of the time we find ways to say what we wanted to say anyway, but it's grounded within the text of the Parsha and the text of the rabbis, right? That's how the project works, is we meld our perspective with the text and the teachings and the practices of those who came before us. And I think there's wisdom in that, and I think there's beauty in that. The one and a half other things I'll say is that it kind of makes me think about, and some of you have probably heard me say this before, right? The hopeful overlap between religion and spirituality, right? You hear a lot today about people who are spiritual but not religious. I think there are also plenty of people who are religious, not spiritual. For me, ideally, it's the Venn diagram, right? That there can be overlap there in terms of religion gives like the structure and the framework and the guidelines and the rituals. The spirituality is the spirit. You also hear like keva and kavanah here, the spirit and the intentionality and the connection. And that ideally you have a spiritually infused religion or a religiously framed spirituality. And that's not for everyone, and that's okay. But that's what I aspire to, and that's what works well for me. And this idea of being anchored in ritual, text, guideline, structure, so that the spirit and the creativity can flower from there. For me, that's a dynamic that makes sense and that I find to be helpful. I think that's true in relationships, right? Committed relationship is that as well, right? Within the framework of my committed relationship to my wife, kids, family, friends, right? That's where creativity can flower. I'm not just going around and having a good time having a relationship with everybody, because that's impossible, right? I set relationships for myself, and it's through that there can be that growth and that expansion. I'll pause there.
Elon has his hand up.
So wouldn't it be more honest to say the following, which is what is written in the scripture is very defined and in fact very confining. We, however, given our modern sensibilities, are going to add creativity to it, but that's what we're adding because that's meaningful to us, and it makes it easier to achieve that Venn diagram of religion and spirituality that you're talking about. I don't feel that one has to read something into the text that's not there in order to make it valid.
Yeah, I hear that. I guess my response to that would be that it depends how broad, I think it depends on your understanding of what creativity is, right? And whether creativity needs to start from a place of no boundaries and a blank canvas and a blank canvas only, or if there can still be creativity within, here's the canvas you are using, here are the paints you are going to use, here are the paintbrushes that you have, make whatever you want.
So we as modern conservative, so Orthodox Jews would obviously, their definition of what is allowed within creative bounds is very different than ours is by definition, right? And right. So I would argue that our understanding and interpretation allows for more creativity than theirs does. And that's not a criticism, that's just perception, right? That what works for them, it doesn't work for us. And I don't feel badly that the Torah says one thing, but we're doing something else. That's fine. Like, right. I don't feel a need to justify it within the confines of the Torah. Yes, you need some boundaries. I get it. Otherwise, what's the point? Right. But we're willing to be a lot more flexible with those boundaries than the Orthodox are, for example.
Right. But my, like, and I am saying this publicly, and I say this to anyone, I think that's what's been happening all along. Right. I think the Torah is itself a commentary on the Torah. I think the rest of the Tanakh is a commentary on the Torah. I think Rabbinic Judaism is a comment, right? I think that's what's been happening all along. And part of what I like about the Kedushat Levi piece is I think he's providing the Parsha-based mystical theological explanation for inspirationally oriented way of thinking about how we've been doing that all along. Right, that's my drash on him, but I think that's authentic. Right, I think that's for me that's an articulation of the Jewish project writ large, regardless of denomination. right? I think even within Orthodox Jew, right? We keep talking about Karaites. Rabbi Schatz, maybe we should bring a Karaite to class one week. Can we do that?
They
Can we bring a Karaite to Workday? That would be very interesting. A Karaite is someone who says that they don't that doesn't ascribe to rabbinic Judaism, that they say Torah only, right? Because we as Jews, we are Jews through the normative lens of the rabbinic understanding of Judaism. That is what most Judaism looks like.
Karaite Jews, just for example, the biggest Karaite community is in Northern California, so I got to know them very well, and they actually davened in our shul for the 2 years that I was there because their shul was under construction. But for example, they will eat a cheeseburger because what it says in the Torah is to not cook a kid in its mother's milk. It doesn't say that you can't put the two things together. So they're very literal from the Torah, but they don't ascribe to the oral traditions that come after the Torah that give us our laws. We don't paskin, we don't make our laws based on the Torah. We make them based on the Shulchan Aruch, which comes from the Talmud. There's my halacha piece. I added something.
We made it. Right. So what I would say to that is I think we're all doing that. And I think Karaites are too, right? I think it's impossible to take the Torah completely literally, because what does that even mean? There are contradictions within the Torah itself. You can't just follow the Torah because you'd go in knots trying to figure out what it says to begin with. So I think that's the project that we're all engaged with. And I think that's very much a creative process that's been a part of the project from the start. And I think having that grounding structure leads to more, not less creativity, actually, because there's that shared experience and you can go in those different directions, but you're actually all part of the same project. Bonnie, you had your hand up, but then you retracted it.
Well, you sort of covered it, but I also have always felt since I started learning more about Judaism that it was always an ongoing process, from whether or not they were living at the time of Abraham or were slaves, or had the temple and then didn't have the temple, and each time they made it work, and here we are, thousands of years later, working it out for ourselves, however it works for us, and I find that very appealing. Yeah. One more super wonky Alon Peaceman idea of the day, which is that there's a modern author, contemporary author, his name is Ken Wilber, and he talks about like integrating like all the different pieces possible, the different wisdoms of the world, and he's new agey, right? He's a new agey guy, and so you'd think that he would have a good amount of disdain for traditional religion. But it's actually quite the opposite. I mean, I think he has mixed feelings about it, but he sees there's value on it. And he talks about how the classic religions of the world, like the great religions of the world, he talks about them as the great conveyor belts, which is a funny image, right? But this idea that within Judaism, for example, and like so too Christianity and Islam and Buddhism, right? But we're talking about Judaism in the moment, I think. Within the Jewish tradition, there are ideas from 3,000 years ago and 2,500 years ago and 2,000 and 1,000 and 500 and 100. Like there are ideas embedded within our tradition from all of these stages of time and thought. And that's actually not just, it's not a bug, it's a feature, because we can look back and see where we've been and we can see how we've evolved and how we've gotten from point A to point B to point C to where we are now. And it's a bit of a tangent, but I bring that up because this sense that by building on that, we're actually accessing wisdom that we wouldn't have if we just started from scratch. That because we're weaving all these pieces together in this tapestry, there's something that can be said for, okay, we're learning from where we've been and we're grounded in that, and there's wisdom in that we wouldn't have if we were just starting over. And because we can draw from that, we're actually laying the groundwork for future people to be able to create from there. All of that to say,
if that doesn't speak to you as a construct, that's that's totally fine, right? Like if what is most inspiring is to say it's better to start over, it doesn't seem like it's authentically grounded in the text, to say that this is really a creative thing, they're just following the blueprint, totally fine. But for me personally, and I think what the text that has now taken up pretty much all of our time together is communicating, is this idea that the enoughness and the more that are indicated in that verse are actually two sides of the same coin. That those who came before us have given us more than enough, have given us enough for us to in turn be able to generate more. And I think that that's a really lovely way of thinking about it. Rabbi Schatz, I think you probably also prepared some stuff.
I did, but it is always better to come prepared and learn from others than to have to share my own stuff. No, I thought this was a very fascinating conversation. And you
were very quiet. What do you think? What do you think about all this?
I do think that they're two sides of the same coin, for sure. I definitely agree with that. The Kedushat Levi piece that I read, which was not this one, it was hard for me to read on your screen quickly, but I saw the word God, and I was like, yeah, probably same thing, but that was silly.
Also a common concept in Hasidic texts.
Yeah, just common guy for most. But the idea of God as Ein Sof is also a very interesting way of thinking about enoughness versus too much, right? That if God is without end, and whether you think that means that God just lasts forever or God's power and ability goes on forever, however you want to interpret Ein Sof, I love the idea that sometimes, even though God is present for us, we might not feel like God is present enough. And there are other moments in which we feel like we are being suffocated by the experience of religion, spirituality, godliness, and that could be too much. And I thought that was a fascinating way of interpreting those two pieces. I also saw and now I'm not remembering who it was because I didn't actually add it to my own source sheet, but a commentator who mentioned that the die part, which by the way, like think dayenu, right, the enoughness, that the die actually is referring to the people, not to the work, and that the abundance is referring to the work. So that the people had felt like they had given enough, but the work came out of them almost as an abundance. And I also think that's beautiful. Susan and I were actually talking about this earlier this week, that like, what kind of worker are you? That are you a person who can put more into the world if you have a lot going on, or are you the kind of person who needs a ton of space to put anything into the world? And so there's this push and pull of, if there's too much, can you find space? And for others, if there's not enough, it feels overwhelming, like you were talking about with the blank page, and therefore you cannot create. I, probably as no surprise to everybody, am the kind of person that I need a lot to be going on for me to create more. Whereas if there's nothing going on, I have a harder time filling that space. So none of those thoughts were connected, but those were all of my thoughts over the past 58 minutes. And Rabbi Kligfeld is giving an entire sermon on this tomorrow. So if this was a topic that you are interested in, definitely come to shul tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And
if not, come anyway, because he'll probably do a better job teaching it than I just did. So.
I think his pieces are quite different than the ones that we chose, but his idea of enoughness is quite interesting. So I have not read it. I've just heard him interpret it. So anyway, I also think it's a very interesting COVID piece, right? Not that everything we learn has to do with the pandemic that we're living in, but I was fascinated and almost overwhelmed by opening up social media this morning and everyone's saying, a year ago, this was the last thing I was doing. A year ago, this was the last thing I was doing. For us, it wasn't actually a year ago today. So in a way, it's like, wow, should we have closed? Like, where were we? But it's overwhelming to see that people are hitting these marks. And Rabbi Yosef Kanevsky wrote a really beautiful piece to his community that basically said, in this pandemic, with so much taken away and so much added on, we recognize that which is the most important to us. And so maybe it's that balance of finding when something is enough or when you have too much and so you have to give.
Amen to that.
But you can close because you taught.
You can close. Well, that was a good close. The one other thing, because there's always one other thing. I realize, I'm a little distracted. We got a cat this week and my cat is snoring in the background. So it's not only do I get distracted now by screaming children, I also now get distracted by snoring cats, because why should we keep things simple? I'll just circle back to the text. Like, I love this idea, because even though there is something like elitist in that text, I still love the idea that, like, I'll overly democratize it, this idea that we really each have something to offer, and that there's teaching that gets built on top of teaching that gets built on top of teaching. I mean, for me, that's like the ideal construct of rabbinic Judaism. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, Alav HaShalom, the one time I heard him teach, he talked about this idea of rabbinic Judaism as all of us like sitting around a table having a conversation together, which is kind of like same page, different playbook, this idea that we're all in conversation with each other. And it's just a beautiful idea. And I think it's what I enjoy about this class, that we're all sort of sitting around a digital table together. And hopefully that as we, thank God, a year later start to move out of the situation we've all been, that we'll find ways to keep amplifying the really democratizing experience that we have all had. I mean, I've talked in here about how I've been able to learn with my teacher in Jerusalem over the past year in a way that I never would have before, because everything's on Zoom now, right? And I think there is something really beautiful about finding ways to expand the voices that we get to hear, because everyone does have something to teach, and hopefully we'll all keep finding ways to be able to learn from each other, because that creativity is something that's endemic and core to all of us.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.